with Roger Penrose winning the Nobel Prize for Physics for his work with Stephen Hawking on the black hole theory. So he's after co-winning the Nobel Prize for Physics this year. I thought it'd be a good time to talk about the cosmogony of science and the mythology of science and how it's developed in the last 100 years just within the physics department. So science isn't something we normally associate with mythology, but if you look at how mythology functions in the psyche of a believer, it's what they take to be true. So if you talk to someone who is a literal believer of the Bible or the Quran, or of Buddhist or Hindu religions, then they will tell you that this is how the world began, this is why the world exists, or this is the nature of reality. And the fact that the belief in that is true shapes the way they live their life. And I think that science, despite its different origins and its different flavor, because it's an empirical evolution and it's not something born from the unconscious necessarily, but from the observation of reality and the twists and turns in the observation of reality. So I think it's even despite the fact that it's scientific, it still develops a mythology. So because something is true, we end up having to take that, and it shapes the way we look at reality. So let's take the difference between the elves and men in Middle Earth. So in another video I talked about how that was like the difference between the Indian and the Western kind of cosmogonies. So with the Indian sects of Hinduism and Buddhism, you get this view of eternity, of the constant cycle of birth and rebirth as they live through the cycle of samsara. So when I die, this body dies, but my ego or some part of my consciousness is reborn in another organism, be that a god or a shrew or a hungry ghost. So you can get born into many different forms, a rich man, a poor man as well. It's not just a transformation out of humanity. And that aspect towards the eternality and the constant cycle of birth and rebirth has led to the emphasis in those religions on being to get disentangled from the cycle of samsara. So you see a desire for enlightenment, and it's the driving energy behind enlightenment because they're looking for moksha, for nirvana, for liberation and freedom from this entrapment within the cycle of birth and rebirth. So it's a very different worldview to, say, the Christian worldview or the pagan Greek worldview, or now the atheistic kind of worldview of the idea that you've only got one life. This is all that counts. If you look at the Homeric accounts and the pagan accounts, yes, there is an afterlife in the Elysian fields, but you're a mere shade of what you were when you were alive. And we see Achilles regretting his death in the underworld in the Odyssey. And then in the Christian view, yes, there is paradise and you get your body back later, but this is still the deciding place. This life is so important, so much more important, because it decides the fate of eternity. So in the West, we've got this idea that so much hangs on this one life. So this life is given extreme importance, whereas in the East, this is just another life among thousands, millions of lives that you will live until you attain liberation. So they lead to that difference in cosmogony leads to very different attitudes towards life. And if you believe in reincarnation, then it's kind of futile to achieve so much in this life because you're just going to be competing with yourself in the next life, and it can undermine the status and the lucre of the present life, and so it undermines the potency of this life unless you're heading towards attaining liberation. So those are two very different perspectives, and we've lived with them for thousands of years. But what I want to talk about in this episode is the scientific worldview and how interesting it is as a species of mythology. Because if you go back to the 1920s and before, the perspective of reality was that there was the ether, there was this space I think it's called static state theory. And space was a permanent, eternal medium in which everything happened, in which the stars were born and died, and planets born and die, and everything happens within this eternal space. But then in around late 1920s, this French priest called Georges Lemaitre, comes up with this theory of the Big Bang. And of course we're all familiar with that, is that at some point in history there was a singularity, and out of that singularity the entire reality, or this entire universe of ours, expanded out of it, and has been expanding ever since. And there was actually a backlash in science initially in the physics community, because it was accusing them of importing a religious concept into science. And that's a very interesting claim, because you can see, even for the scientists, that notion of religion being mixed in with cosmogony was not alien. They were not unaware of it. They were just trying to follow the science to where it led. But there was this backlash, and the main guy who led the backlash, he didn't die until the first decade of the 21st century, still denying that the Big Bang existed. And in an article I read in it, they said that people don't change their mind. You just wait for the people who believe the old thing to die off. But obviously that's a bit of an exaggeration, and most scientists did take on the Big Bang theory. But, and this is where Roger Penrose comes in, there's a new theory. And Roger Penrose, for the last couple of decades, has been saying that in the cosmic background microwave radiation, so this is the furthest bit of light we can see away. So the Hubble telescope can see the most distant stretch of light beyond all the stars, and it's 13.75 billion years away, and you can see the impression of the Big Bang. And that's how the Big Bang was proved to exist. But Roger Penrose says that in that background microwave radiation, you can see the impression of the universe before. And so that opens up a very interesting change, because if that's true, then you'll find that the mythology moves more towards an Eastern model again, where there's a constant cycle of birth and rebirth of universes, where universes collapse in and expand out, and so you get that eternality of time. You don't just have this one stretch of time since the Big Bang. This isn't all there is. You don't get that emphasis on the single life anymore, but that the universes go on forever. And that's a shift. In 100 years, you've got the shift from an idea that space is eternal, to the idea that it was created at a specific point in time and this is the only universe. And now you've got this idea that universes cycle through, and you can see the impression of a previous universe in this one. And those are three very different worldviews. And you think about the stability normally with religions. Like Christianity was believed for 2,000 years. We'll give it 2,000 years of hegemony in the West, and before that you had the pagan religions who were around for God knows how long. And in the East, the idea of reincarnation, that's been around for at least 3,000 years, this wheel of samsara, at least since the Vedas, so probably at least 4,000 years. And so you see those mythologies, that cosmogony, that cosmogenic theory in religions tends to be quite stable over time, and allows you some kind of a psychological peace, a bit of you know what the nature of reality is, and you forget about it, and you just start building anew. Whereas we've seen in the space of one lifetime, because of science, that three oscillations between very different theories. So science is yes, it's dedicated to the truth, but because we're in the process of finding truth, it's you can't get too attached to any theory, to one worldview, and we've seen it transform three times in 100 years, and it just makes you wonder, what is the truth? But also, it also makes you wonder, well, with science, what's the correct attitude? What is the mythological thing of science? And perhaps the attitude isn't that to move towards an Eastern view with the new Penrosian theory, or a more typical Western view with the Big Bang. I guess the attitude is just to roll with the punches. what science is teaching us, because of its changeable nature, is to be open, is to keep an open mind and to not get too attached to any theory. And that goes against the grain of what we humans have done almost forever. And you might question whether it's got survival value, whether that's actually, whether humans can stand that much change in their fundamental worldview, and whether our mental health can continue over a long period of time in a universe where everything is constantly changing and where nothing is certain. And certainly that could be a contributor to some kind of mental health crisis that we're seeing. I know that Nietzsche was so afraid in the 1884, I think, when he said that God is dead and we have killed him. And he compared that death of God to a supernova. And the light of that supernova had not reached us. We are the ones that killed God, but the light of that supernova hadn't reached us. And that's because the reason why he was so afraid of that was because it undermines our fundamental beliefs. And God was the thing that justified everything else. So Nietzsche feared that by taking away that, the rest of it would crumble. Now, I think that fear was, in many senses, overestimated, but I do wonder, with this constant shifting of the tectonic plates of science and of the beliefs and the understandings of reality as of now, what the consequences of that are psychologically on a deep level. And yeah, so I guess that's just everything that I had to share today. Just got me thinking about it since Penrose won the Nobel Prize for Physics, and it's kind of sad to see that Hawking didn't get it. He died in 2018, and because it was for black hole theory, but it just took so long for it to be awarded. So there's a kind of a sadness there with that, but it's great to see that he would have gotten it, and it's great to see Penrose getting it now in 2020. He shared it with another group. So yeah, that was my thought for the day. I hope you've enjoyed it, and yeah, please subscribe if you haven't already, and otherwise I shall see you next time. Thanks for watching.